You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the BioHealth Capital Region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in BioHealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis, your host for BioTalk, and we have a special edition of BioTalk today. It's what I'm going to call sort of a mid-year edition with one of our frequent visitors, Alex Philippidis, who's the senior business editor for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News, better known as GEN, and also a regular participant at the BioHealth Capital Region Forum. And Alex has agreed to speak at our 11th annual Biotech Forum, which is going to be September 23rd, 24th, and 25th at USP, US Pharmacopoeia in Rockville again this year. So, Alex, welcome to BioTalk again.
Thanks, Rich, for having me. Glad to be back.
Yeah, I mean, this was sort of an impulse thing, but with all of the things that are happening nationally, internationally, government, industry, investment, I just thought it might be good to do a little mid-year review based on all of the things that are happening around our industry that both you and I are focused on. So, and we had some breaking news today that I might lead off with, and I know you're just getting up to speed on some of this, but there was news about the proposed Trump administration budget related to HHS, NIH, FDA, CDC, and they're talking about a 40% reduction that would go from 120 billion to about 80 billion overall. And for NIH, it would be about 47 billion down to $27 billion. With the elimination of a number of institutes and a consolidation of a number of others. And really, this has many implications for industry, academia, small business, entrepreneurs, and everyone. So this is just what is proposed. It's not approved yet because it'll need approvals from a congressional level before anything like this gets put in place. But it's a little disconcerting to see the amount of decrease that is being proposed, Alex. And I'd like to get your initial reaction to this.
Well, we saw the one shoe drop at the beginning of this month with fairly sizable job cutting, 10,000 jobs that the HHS had begun to eliminate at the start of April. And now this is the other shoe with the budget for HHS and several of its key agencies that affect biopharma. You mentioned HHS, which would, under this proposal, go down from 121 billion to 80 billion. NIH going from 47 billion to 27 billion. But what really struck me was plans to close down 19 out of 27 of NIH's institutes and centers. Among those set to close are institutes focused on minority health and health disparities. That's not a surprise given the policy focus of the Trump administration. Also, nursing research, which is a little bit more sobering to see because there's been so much attention paid to the struggle of healthcare providers to find nurses to make up for so many that have left the profession since COVID and the pandemic 5 years ago. So that Nursing Research Institute, although, again, one of the director of that, and I'll look for the name, Shannon Zenk, who had been the director of NIH's National Institute of Nursing Research, was among the key administrators that were either placed on administrative leave or let go as part of that early April push of people from HHS and the component agencies. CDC going down almost half, from 9.2 billion to 5.2 billion. And it was known that the administration would really focus on shrinking the purview and the functions of CDC. There is a sense, and I've seen that argument actually from Robert Redfield, the former CDC director, wrote a commentary that was published by the Heritage Foundation. That's a think tank conservative in its focus that CDC had overlooked by starting to look at social science determinants of diseases, that he felt that that was an overreach for the agency. So the financial bloodletting is going to be Well, it'll be up to Congress to try to tamp that down. Now, we saw in President Trump's first term, he had tried some significant cuts to agencies. Now, at that time, those did not stand because there was still a consensus within Congress by both parties at that point to especially keep the NIH at least at fairly level funding. I'd be curious to see whether that's going to hold this time around. I think with both houses of Congress in the same party as President Trump, I see a little bit more financial cutting this time around, though I don't know that would be quite along the levels that we're seeing. Because remember, for a lot of senators, a lot of members of Congress, that activity from these agencies, NIH, CDC, that goes into their districts. And they have universities and colleges, research institutes, and even companies that interact with these agencies and will try to create some pressure to tamp down the extent of the spending cuts. But I do see some fiscal bloodletting happening, though.
Yeah, there's probably some reduction that need to happen or redundancies that may be there. We just hope that the analysis that's been done has been done in a way to where it's going to be done in the best interest of research, science, and what's needed to benefit and improve upon the healthcare of all Americans in the future. But there's many other areas or topics to talk about other than just this new news that was breaking today, Alex. Let's talk a little bit about FDA and past cuts in the FDA workforce, what the implications of those cuts are going to mean for small and mid-sized bio, even big biopharma companies. And these companies really rely on this agency guidance through their clinical development. Question is, what's going to happen with reduced manpower to be able to provide this guidance to these companies?
Well, Rich, FDA took the brunt of the 10,000 person workforce cut that was going to be carried out at the beginning of this month. 3,500 FDA jobs were slated to be eliminated, 1/3 of the total 10,000 across HHS. Now, this week, in his first interview with a news outlet, this one, Megyn Kelly's site, the new FDA Commissioner, Marty Makary, said that the cutbacks were more back office and communications functions rather than reviewers. So it was his view that it wouldn't affect the activity of companies looking for reviews for new drugs and devices as much. But to answer your question, Rich, I think smaller to mid-sized biotechs will see some impact because they've come to rely on the FDA to walk them through clinical development to make sure they aren't making some mistake in the process that could cost them time and especially money. And this is especially the case when companies seek guidance on how many clinical studies they need in order to be considered for an approval. And what do these studies need to show the agency? What endpoints should the clinical trials use? And what should the results show? Now, how will companies react? They could either come to swallow that it may take them a little longer to go through regulatory reviews, hopefully not too much longer if what Commissioner Makary said bears out, or the companies may react. They'll try to move things along in the process, maybe try to hire some more expertise, but that's going to be costly to them. And smaller companies don't always have that expertise, period, whether it's in-house or a consultant. So one incentive, if companies choose to stick it out, Makary spoke about streamlining review requirements. For example, requiring one randomized trial instead of two, especially for rare disease drugs such as single-arm accelerated approvals based on, quote, plausible mechanism of action, and reducing animal testing requirements, which was Makary's first significant policy initiative announcement a few days back. So I think companies will have to at least rethink how they interact with the agency, and we'll see how much that changes in coming months.
Yeah. Another thing related to the regulatory environment, basically the FDA, US FDA is sort of the gold standard, and everybody wants to get the regulations approved here in the US. But do you think there might be a shift of some of the firms going to Europe and the EMA or maybe to Australia, which has different processes than what the US FDA has, and trying to get some approvals externally first before going through the US FDA?
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Australia, and that's really interesting to me because I had that in mind to talk about here because Australia is renowned for facilitating clinical trials. And even many smaller biopharmas look to conduct trials there because of the encouragement that they see from Australian regulators. But it depends on the company, to answer your question, Rich. If a company has more of a global outlook to begin with or is planning for larger growth, then yeah, I could see more engagement with European or UK or Asia Pacific regulators. Smaller biotechs and those that are more US focused, yeah, them I think would be more likely to stick it out in the US. As has been pointed out to me in interviews with folks, the communication between FDA and company leaders, especially a chief medical officer or a regulatory team, is ongoing. So we'll need to watch in coming months to see if those communications change. Do they become more limited because of the lack of personnel? And is there going to be a lack of trust toward the FDA given the departure of so many staffers and administrators? I hope not, but we'll have to wait and see. To also watch for, I would say, includes what kind of guidance will the FDA be giving in terms of trial design, structure, scientific parameters, such as endpoints, which I mentioned earlier. That would be where trust could be either maintained or eroded. And what effect will those guidelines, if there are changes, have on the speed of reviews and especially decisions based on reviews? And I think by the summer, we'll have a better idea than we do now as to whether the FDA will continue as a general policy adhering to PDUFA dates. PDUFA stands for Prescription Drug User Fee Act. Those are the target dates set by the FDA for decisions on reviews of new drugs and biologics and devices. Now, PDUFA is a guideline. Actually, this is more drugs. It's not mandatory, though the agency over the decades has sought to adhere to PDUFA dates so that biotechs can know generally when they may have approvals at hand and hopefully not rejections. You'll hear a case anecdotally here and there where a PDUFA date may be extended or take longer if the agency has questions or on a trial methodology, for example. So that would be a barometer, if you will, to how much the agency can continue doing business and thus facilitating, helping companies bring new drugs and biologics to market.
One of the things that's the most topical these days really relates to tariffs and what the implications are going to be to manufacturing costs. So we know the implications it's having on our stock markets, the Dow Jones, the S&P, which we monitor every day. And it's a major factor, which is the peaks and valleys we're going through with all of our stock indices. What do you think about the implications in the biopharma industry, the medical device industry on these tariffs? And what are companies trying to do to address them in the event that they stay long term? And do you see companies trying to do anything from a reshoring standpoint or come back to America if some of these components that they need in the manufacturing process in either therapeutics or medical devices? Or what's just your overall opinion of the impact of these tariffs?
Well, to answer one question, we've seen a few of the very large pharma giants talk about stepping up manufacturing in the United States. Novartis, with a $20+ billion initiative announced a few days back. Eli Lilly in late March talked about building 4 new facilities totaling $27 billion. Pfizer's CEO Albert Bourla said his company could do more manufacturing in the United States, where it has 13 facilities. And those were seen as efforts by leaders in biopharma to engage with the Trump administration and meet it on one of its key policy goals, which is to bring more manufacturing and its higher paying jobs to the United States. So at least with the larger companies, we're seeing talk, though for any plant, it takes anywhere from 3-4+ years to get it from finding a location to raising the financing to building the facility to actually getting it going. So, yeah, that may wind up being a longer term triumph of policy. Now, for smaller companies, it's just occurring. I mean, based on some interviews I've had, that it's occurring to these companies that they're looking at all kinds of components of drug manufacturing that could be swept up into these new tariffs. It could be the box, could be the capsule, could be the syringe, where all of a sudden they're looking at profit and loss statements of these companies. I had an interview that was published this past week of our reporting week with Lorenzo Pauletti, who's the managing director of biotech investment banking unit of Truist Securities. And he made a very good point that all of a sudden the profit and loss of these companies, from revenues to earnings before interest and taxes to earnings per share, could change depending how extensive the tariffs are. And there's been at least several warnings from President Trump himself that he's looking at tariffs on biopharma imports. And all of a sudden, if you're a CFO of a public biotech and you're affected by these dynamics, Lorenzo made the point, you need to think very hard about what you're going to say next quarter, quarter by quarter. So this is something that industry is still trying to figure out. And that's, I think, what companies are working on now. The larger leaders in industry, like Albert Bourla, who's also the chair of Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, have been meeting and engaging with President Trump and administration officials to try to ideally, if not stave off, then to soften the blow of whatever future tariffs befall pharma. And we'll have to wait and see how that effort plays out, how far they can persuade the administration to hold off or maybe limit whatever new tariffs come on board. So that's still up in the air.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a wait and see on that. But unfortunately, it's having a negative implication to the financial markets, which help drive the growth within the biopharma industry for sure. So let's talk about the financial areas and certain aspects of the financial implications of what's going on with the administration policy changes and budget recommendations. Let's start with venture capital. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing happening in the venture capital world right now as it relates to the biopharma industry.
You mentioned on venture capital, I saw where just earlier this month, LifeSci VC, that's Bruce Booth's venture capital firm, came out earlier this month with some interesting new info on first quarter venture capital activity, which was that there was $5 billion in venture funding for biotech, which is about what recent quarters have done. And then over the past 12 months, he's counted about $25 billion invested. Now, he compared this to 2017, and the amount of venture funding is 50% higher than the first quarter of 2017 and 25% higher than the first quarter of 2018. And it's more than triple to quadruple the start of bull market cycles in 2013, 2014. So, I mean, on the one hand, there's still $100 million plus mega rounds being announced. But what that means is that these are usually companies that are further along getting Series Bs and Series Cs, which isn't the best news for the Series A company or companies in seed and pre-A funding. So the point is that there's plenty of capital around, and firms are a little more selective for now as to where they choose to deploy that capital. So that raises a question for private companies looking to go public. Do they pursue capital in private markets with deeper discounts and dilution of equity that they have to give up as a result? Or do they instead pursue either selling assets or partnering assets with bigger partners? So there's been some of that. One glimmer of hope that I'll be wanting to look more at in coming weeks is the gene therapy area. We're coming out with a list in May of top 10 best-selling gene therapies as of last year's numbers. And at least, first off, you have more than 10 companies with disclosed sales of some kind or other to pick and choose from. We didn't have that in past years. As far as private gene therapy companies, no fewer than 5 have raised the combined more than $500 million, $534 million this year. That was as of this week. Tune Therapeutics getting the biggest of these financings, $175 million plus back in January. The other companies, Etsena Therapeutics, $150 million, Series C, Arbor Biotechnologies, EpiCRISPR Biotechnologies, Xylocore Therapeutics being the others. And so, at least in an area where there'd been some question as to whether investors will want to support more gene therapies. There's ongoing issues of dosing, how large a dose can you have it? Sometimes you'll see headline news that's even tragic, as happened to Sarepta Therapeutics with Elevidis and a patient treated with the therapy who passed away. But there's still confidence in gene therapy that at least investors are looking at companies further down the road for that.
I wish there were more bright spots than just the cell and gene therapy area. Like, at least there's one, but I want to talk a little bit more about the implications to the small and medium-sized biopharma and biohealth companies. I think we have multiple whammies happening right now. The VCs, as you mentioned, are going to clinical stage companies that are further in the clinical cycle. They might be at phase 1, phase 2. Generally, preclinical companies are having an unbelievably difficult time raising capital. If this cut in the NIH happens, the SBIR program is determined as a percentage of the overall NIH budget. And I don't know if this statistic's correct, but I think NIH has published some data that 75% of almost every drug that has been approved by the FDA has received some public funding at some stage in its evolution to get into the commercial market. Take another thing and put it into consideration. The federal funding affects academic institutions and state governments who are dependent on federal funding, and state governments also provide funding for early stage companies through some of their programs. So when you put all of these factors together, entrepreneurs in the preclinical and the pre-seed and the seed stage today are in one of the most challenging financing times that they've ever had in our history. And I don't know if you're observing that across the country.
I'm seeing that from the perspective of, say, earlier stage companies wondering where they're going to find the money. Certainly, some might have a big money partner, a pharma, for example, and that's great for them. But many others don't, and they'll be looking. One company I just came across this past week, Siren Biotechnology on West Coast, and they are beginning to raise a community funding round, as they call it. It's sort of like a GoFundMe without reaching out to GoFundMe and looking for capital in smaller, mid to larger amounts from a variety of sources. Just simply ask. And I think you'll see some more of that in coming weeks. And at some point, I'll reach out to the company and learn more about how they'll be raising and why they've chosen to go this route. That's sort of what I'm really most curious about, is given that smaller companies or a growing number are struggling and trying to beat the bushes, so to speak, to figure out where to raise the next big round from. So that's something definitely want to see. I mean, I just had someone come up to me, a couple of months ago, and just basically you cite the difficulty. And she had a company that's been in business for at least a good 15 years.
And it's funny you mentioned community funding. We were just on a phone call this week. We're going to do a BioTalk with a company that's a device company that's actually doing a community funding round as well right now. And to be honest with you, it's not a term that you've heard socialized in our industry over the past many years, but everybody's looking at creative forms of funding that they can find. And it means a lot of small investors rather than going after your VCs, private equity firms, or family offices. You have to find the community that will rally around you with your technology to hopefully get you closer to going into the market. But we can compare notes on community funding with the company we're working with, one you're working with, and it'll be an interesting story to see how that trend continues. So let's talk one other element in the financial markets. And I know you track M&A that goes on in the biopharma industry too. Talk a little bit about what you observed in the first 4 or 5 months, or the first 4 months of this year related to M&A activity.
M&A started strong this year. During JP Morgan back in January, we saw an acquisition deal 3 times the biggest deal of all of 2024. And that was Johnson & Johnson agreeing to buy intracellular therapies out of New York City. near my suburban part of the world for $14.6 billion. Now, remember, the biggest M&A deal for 2024 was Vertex Pharma buying Alpine Immune Sciences out of Seattle for $4.9 billion. But lately, not as many big deals are happening, although deals are still taking place. Jazz Pharma, for example, agreeing to acquire Chimerix for $935 million, and Bristol Myers Squibb agreeing to acquire 2seventy Bio for $286 million. Although 2seventy's case is really a rescue of BMS's partner in creating Abecma, that's a multiple myeloma drug. And 2seventy had struggled ever since it was spun out from Bluebird Bio. 2seventy was originally the cancer pipeline and assets of Bluebird, and it was spun out back in 2021. Now, what I've heard lately, both from my own interviews plus numerous articles in biotech and general interest publications, is that because the Trump administration has not yet spelled out its plans around all of the FDA-related changes and tariffs, many industry leaders and stakeholders said they did not know the extent of the actions that the administration was going to take. And that's kind of interesting to me and frankly surprising, because during the first Trump administration, President Trump carried out tariffs, notably on China. And during a successful campaign last year, Trump said out loud he'd continue to pursue tariffs as a policy he reasons will bring manufacturing back to the U.S. So it's not like the industry couldn't have foreseen a push on tariffs that would have been higher octane than what he pursued in his first term. Now, one thing I do see on M&A is smaller, smarter deals, and that was predicted by people I spoke to even around the end of last year and earlier this year. One reason for the smaller deals is we need to see the market stabilize. And as companies see and absorb and digest all these policy changes. So one person I talked to, an analyst, reasons that by the tail end of the second quarter, maybe mid-third quarter, we might start to see more activity perk up on M&A, but he's predicting more deals in the sub $5 billion range.
Yeah, I think a lot of the implications on both IPO and M&A really gets down to valuation. So if you look at what the value of the companies are today, as you're either trying to raise money or if you're trying to exit at this particular point in time, valuations tend to be down. And if you can find ways to fund yourself until the market improves and the valuations will increase, you're going to be in a much better position. But I think there's so many small companies in a survival mode right now that they're not going to have that luxury. And they're going to have to make some either drastic cuts, they're going to have to pivot the direction they are with their company today, or they're going to have to really find hard a strategic partner. And sometimes they're going to have to take a major cut in their valuation in order just to have that survival going on. So I hope, as you say, that maybe at the end of the second quarter and beginning of the third quarter, we'll see a little upswing there. But I'm hearing that basically we might be going through all of 2025 before we see any major changes occurring in a significant increased activity. And a lot of that has to do with basically return on investment and valuations of these companies.
Well, also the nature of the convulsiveness of the changes affecting both the economy and Washington, keeping companies staying put.
Well, yeah, I mean, how'd you like to be a vaccine company now based on the administration's position on vaccines?
Yeah, that would be odd. And what's interesting is I remember asking companies, gee, do you foresee any slow walking of vaccine reviews or any more impediments as a result? And it was downplayed, at least publicly. If companies felt they would, they kept it close to the vest. In the end, it looks like we will see some fairly significant changes in how vaccines are looked at and reviewed, taking aim at the mRNA or messenger RNA vaccines like the kind that COVID was, although it looks like the extra vaccine scrutiny isn't just limited to mRNA, as Novavax found out earlier this month.
Yeah, you're right. It's just something that continues to be monitored, and hopefully the administration will have a change of heart on generally the overall vaccine market in total rather than some of the niches within that vaccine market. So you and I normally talk about the top 10 biopharma clusters in the United States, and this really hasn't been the topic for this discussion, but biopharma clusters are going to be impacted by all of these policy and budget changes within the government as well. So what trends are you seeing in some of the major clusters? Because there's high concentrations of small and medium-sized companies, especially in Boston and San Francisco, that potentially are going to have some negative implications due to these policy and budget changes.
Yeah, although, I mean, I feel mixed because with Boston and San Francisco, you do have ecosystems of very sizable employers and especially institutions. Thing is, the institutions are going to face a lot of challenges if indeed NIH funding gets cut to the extent that we're hearing talked about. And those have been anchors of these areas. As for the companies, so many of them were spinouts of universities or research institutes and the like. So, yeah, that's something that I'll be studying in coming weeks and months when I get going on updating the annual list top 10 US biopharma clusters, which I've been happy to present at forums in recent years.
Yeah, so let's close by you looking into your crystal ball. So basically, 2025, 2026, if you had to write your article tomorrow about what your forecasts and projections are for the rest of this year and looking into the future, talk a little bit about the biopharma industry projections.
Sure. I think one thing is I don't see a lot of IPO activity quickly. We had this roller coaster in the overall stock market tied to tariffs. And until that settles down, you'll see some specific companies maybe going public here and there where companies have been in business for a while, have something further along in the clinic, have some inner strength to build upon. But I don't think that there's the big rush that at least some folks had predicted for 2025. And I think part of that is because there's still uncertainty over whether large mergers will get a nod from the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. At first, it was thought that a second Trump administration would just be a 180 from the very strict kind of FTC oversight we've seen during the Biden administration, but that's not yet apparent. So also, one thing I see is that larger biopharmas will want to spread out their R&D operations worldwide, which they can do, but that's a little harder for a smaller company to be able to do. So I think they're still going to wait and see how changes play out in the States and go from there.
Yeah, we've been talking with Alex Philippidis, who's the senior business editor for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News. And I'm going to let you have the last word. Is there anything that we haven't talked about today, Alex, that you feel that the listeners would be interested in knowing based on your wisdom?
Well, one thing is that you're still seeing a lot of new innovative technologies come to fore. And I think that's been very encouraging to see. We had a company I just finished writing about a couple of days ago called Atovia Therapeutics that raised $90 million in Series C, and they have multi-specific antibodies. So they're pursuing 3 or more targets ideally. Oh, they have bispecifics as well. And their lead candidate and their first one is a single specific. So they're looking at immune-mediated disorders. And I've been encouraged to see companies still at work, and at least from a standpoint of innovation continue, but that innovation will take them as far as their finances will. And that's still a wait and see.
Yeah, I think that's my biggest challenge and concern over everything that's going on now is that I don't want to see the United States lose its innovation superiority, the entrepreneurial leadership that we've exhibited over centuries in the United States. And I'm just hoping that we still have those pioneers, entrepreneurs out there who are willing to push forward in spite of all odds. Americans are survivors, and we've gone through ups and down cycles for many times in our lifetime and prior to our lifetime. And I think that we'll end up surviving what goes on with this administration and the policies or budget cuts that are going on right now. But the strong will survive and the most innovative will survive. And we just need to continue that same passion for innovation in America that we've had in the past, Alex.
Great. I agree.
So thank you for being on BioTalk again. Next time we talk, we'll probably be getting ready for the BioForum in September. Hopefully we'll have some good news to talk about and about some changes that have occurred that are positive within our biopharma industry as we get ready for our 11th annual Bioforum. So we look forward to seeing you in person in Rockville in September, and thank you for being on BioTalk again today.
Thanks so much, Rich, for having me.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.